January 15th, 2007. The quiet, picture-perfect suburb of Westfield, New Jersey was about to be shaken to its core. Around 4:30 p.m., Susan Myers, a longtime neighbor and friend of Helen Witman, noticed something off. Helen was an early riser, a creature of habit. Her curtains were always drawn open by sunrise. Her house always buzzing with activity. But today, silence. The blinds remained shut, the door unanswered, the house unusually still. After multiple unanswered calls, Susan walked over, concerned. She rang the bell, knocked, called Helen's name. Nothing. But then, she noticed a narrow slit between the curtains. She leaned in, and what she saw would haunt her forever. Furniture overturned, walls smeared with what looked like blood. And on the floor lay Helen Witman, lifeless, twisted, alone. Susan stumbled back, trembling, barely able to call 911. Moments later, sirens filled the street. Red and blue lights flashed across the neighborhood's perfect white fences. The Witman residence, once a symbol of suburban peace, had become the scene of a horrific crime. Who killed Helen Witman? And why? The answer would unravel a web of secrets buried deep beneath manicured lawns and quiet smiles, and expose a story no one saw coming. To the outside world, the Witman family had it all. A stately two-story home in the heart of Westfield, white picket fence, perfectly trimmed hedges, holiday wreaths on the door, family photos on the mantle. It was the kind of house that made people say, "I wish I lived there." And at the center of it all was Helen Witman, 32 years old, a beautiful, graceful woman who seemed to float through her daily routine like a ballet dancer, always smiling, always poised. And then there was her husband, David Witman, a successful financial advisor, polished, ambitious, respected. His work brought in enough to afford comfort, status, and stability. To anyone looking in from the outside, Helen and David were living the suburban dream. But behind the closed doors of that picturesque home, the dream had begun to fade. David's career meant frequent travel, late nights, missed dinners, missed anniversaries. And Helen, though she never said it out loud, felt the growing emptiness creep in. Her days became a blur of laundry, dishes, errands, the rhythm of routine pounding on her like clockwork. She had traded passion for predictability, connection for comfort. And in the stillness of each day, something inside her began to ache. She watched other couples at the grocery store, laughing. She watched her neighbors holding hands on weekend walks. And in those moments, a silent question formed. Is this really it? She and David rarely spoke beyond the surface. Conversations were transactional. Good morning. What's for dinner? I'll be back late. There was no intimacy, no spontaneity, just a perfectly curated life that had grown cold. Helen didn't hate her husband, but she no longer knew him. And what's worse, she no longer recognized herself. That's the thing about perfect lives. Sometimes they're nothing more than painted masks, and behind Helen's mask was a woman slowly drowning in quiet desperation. She didn't know it yet, but that yearning, that aching for something more, would soon pull her into a relationship that would change everything. Not with her husband, but with the man who lived just next door, 37 years her senior. George Sinclair was not the kind of man people noticed. At 69 years old, he was quiet, polite, and almost invisible. A retired engineer, a widower. He kept to himself, gardening, walking, nodding politely to neighbors. To most, George was simply that nice old man next door. But to Helen Witman, he would become something far more dangerous. It began innocently. One afternoon, Helen struggled with a bag of groceries on her front porch. George happened to be passing by. He offered to help. She smiled, surprised, not just by the kindness, but by how nice it felt to be noticed. As a thank you, she invited him in for a cup of tea. What started as tea turned into hours of conversation. For the first time in years, Helen felt heard. George listened, not with the distracted ears of a busy husband, but with genuine attention. He asked questions. He remembered her answers. He noticed her, and he understood loneliness. He had lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. Since then, his days had been filled with silence. In Helen, he saw light. In George, she found warmth. Their conversations became routine. A few minutes turned into hours. Laughter replaced awkwardness. Soon he began stopping by, even when he wasn't invited. And Helen didn't mind. In fact, she looked forward to it. One rainy afternoon, as they sat side by side on the couch, the space between them seemed to vanish. Helen leaned in. Or maybe he did. The kiss was brief, tentative. But in that moment, something irreversible happened. A line was crossed, and neither of them would turn back. From then on, their affair grew bolder. George would visit when David was away, which was often. They met in secret. They shared more than their stories. They shared their bodies, their needs, their fears. For Helen, the affair became her escape, a place where she felt alive again, desired. For George, it was a second chance at intimacy, at youth, at mattering. But there was one problem. What began as comfort was turning into obsession. And like most things born in the dark, their secret wasn't just unsustainable, it was deadly. A cold, quiet Monday afternoon. The streets of Westfield were calm, families returning from work, children playing in yards. But at number 28 Willow Lane, a haunting silence lingered. Helen Witman's home, once lively and warm, was now still and cold. No lights, no movement, curtains drawn tight. Susan Myers, her next-door neighbor, felt something was wrong. Helen never missed her morning routine. She always opened her blinds, greeted the sun, and waved hello from her front porch. But that day, nothing. Susan had called, left voicemails, walked over. She rang the bell, knocked, called out, but no answer. She circled to the side of the house, hoping to catch a glimpse inside through the living room window. And through the narrow opening in the curtain, she saw it, a room in chaos, furniture overturned, cushions torn, a table shattered. But most chilling was the pool of dark red spreading across the carpet, and in the middle of it, a body, twisted, lifeless. It was Helen. Susan stumbled back, heart racing, her breath caught in her throat. Her trembling fingers fumbled for her phone, dialed 911. My neighbor is... she's dead. There's blood everywhere. Within minutes, the serene neighborhood transformed into a crime scene. Police cruisers, an ambulance, yellow tape. The air buzzed with sirens and shock. Helen Witman, the seemingly perfect suburban wife, was dead. And from the look of the scene, she hadn't gone peacefully. Detective Marie Collins arrived at dawn the next day. 15 years on the force, but few cases would haunt her like this one. She stepped into the living room, now frozen in time. A coffee mug shattered on the floor, curtains half ripped from the rod, blood smeared across white walls. Near Helen's body, a heavy silver candlestick lay stained and abandoned. But it wasn't the weapon, not yet. No forced entry, no signs of burglary. This wasn't random, it was personal. Someone Helen trusted had killed her, and Detective Collins was about to uncover secrets that would rip the mask off a picture-perfect life and expose a love that should never have existed. The morning after the discovery of Helen Witman's body, Detective Marie Collins stood alone in the living room. The heart of a home now frozen in terror. She had seen death before, but there was something different about this scene. Something personal, something emotional. The room wasn't just chaotic, it was violated. The coffee table was split in half. A shattered vase lay in the corner. Picture frames, cracked, fallen, and blood, a terrifying amount, stained the carpet, the sofa, even the baseboards. Detective Collins scanned the scene, her eyes trained on every detail. A heavy candlestick, cast aside, suspiciously clean. A smear of blood on the edge of the fireplace. But one thing stood out most. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no busted locks, no struggle at the door. Helen had let her killer in, willingly. Upstairs, the bedrooms were untouched, neatly made, undisturbed. The kitchen was spotless. Whatever had happened here, in the living room, with someone she trusted. As the forensic team began to dust for fingerprints and document the scene, Collins turned her attention to the people around Helen: friends, family, neighbors. And then came the call she had been waiting for: the autopsy report. Helen had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a massive skull fracture. Death was almost instantaneous. But the weapon? Not the candlestick on the floor. That was a red herring. The real murder weapon was something far more personal: a trophy, a high school football trophy that once belonged to Helen's husband, David. It had sat proudly on the mantle for years until it was used to kill his wife. The shape of the base matched the wound exactly, and there was more. Defensive wounds on Helen's arms, bruising around her wrists. She had fought back. She had tried to get away. Whoever killed her didn't just strike once. They struck again and again, until the woman who once smiled from every photo in that house was gone. It wasn't just murder, it was rage. And now Detective Collins had one clear mission: find the person Helen trusted enough to let inside that door, and angry enough to end her life. When a murder happens without forced entry, the list of suspects shrinks fast. And in Helen Witman's case, Detective Collins had a name rising to the top of that list: George Sinclair, the 69-year-old neighbor. He was the last known person to visit Helen. He had a close relationship with her, and there were whispers. Neighbors had noticed George stopping by more often than seemed appropriate. Long visits, closed curtains, a warmth between them that didn't quite feel platonic. When questioned, George didn't deny it. He admitted to the affair. "She was lonely," he said softly, "and so was I." But when asked where he was the afternoon of Helen's death, George fumbled. His story was vague, disjointed. And then came the evidence. The forensic team had been combing through the house meticulously, and what they found would shift the case dramatically. On the trophy used to kill Helen, they found fingerprints, George Sinclair's fingerprints. And that wasn't all. Hidden in a laundry basket at George's home, investigators found a white dress shirt with small, dark stains around the cuffs. Preliminary testing confirmed it was Helen's blood. When confronted with this, George had an explanation, a weak one. He claimed Helen had cut herself days earlier while cooking, and in her panic, he had helped her clean up. But the stains weren't consistent with a minor kitchen injury. They were spatter patterns, not smears. They told a story of violence, not clumsiness. As the evidence piled up, George's calm began to crack. His hands shook. His voice wavered. Sweat gathered at his temples. Detective Collins laid the photos in front of him: the fingerprints, the blood-stained shirt, the absence of an alibi. And then the question: "George, did you kill Helen Witman?" For a long moment, silence. And then a whisper, a trembling voice: "I loved her. I never wanted to hurt her." The truth was unraveling, and with it, the image of a gentle old man, shattered. What began as comfort had become control. What began as connection had become obsession. And soon the world would learn what really happened on that cold January afternoon, when love turned to rejection, and rejection turned to murder. The room was silent. Detective Marie Collins leaned forward, her voice steady. "Tell me what happened, George." And then he broke. The words spilled out slowly at first, then faster, choked by emotion. What he said next would leave even the most seasoned officers shaken. "I loved her," he whispered. "She was all I had." On the afternoon of January 15th, George had done what he'd done so many times before. He knocked on Helen's door. She let him in. But something was different. Helen was quiet, distant. She wouldn't look him in the eye. And when he asked what was wrong, she told him. "This has to stop," she said. "It's over." George froze. "What do you mean it's over?" Helen explained that she still loved her husband, that the affair had been a mistake, that it was time to move on, that she wanted to fix her marriage. George begged her to reconsider. He reminded her of their talks, their shared loneliness, their passion, but Helen had already made up her mind. "Please," she said gently, Don't make this harder than it has to be. And then she turned her back to walk away. Something in George snapped. All the months of longing, the nights spent waiting, the illusion of love shattered in an instant. He looked around, and there it was, sitting innocently on the fireplace mantel. A trophy, a symbol of Helen's past, of her life before him, of everything he could never truly be a part of. He grabbed it, and with a cry not of rage, but of pain, he struck her. Once, then again, and again. Helen collapsed, hitting the coffee table. But he didn't stop, not until the woman he said he loved was no longer breathing. And when he saw the blood, when the weight of what he'd done began to sink in, he dropped the trophy and ran, hoping it was a nightmare, hoping somehow it could all go away. But it didn't. Now, sitting in an interrogation room, hands trembling and heart shattered, George Sinclair finally said the words out loud. I killed her. It wasn't premeditated, it wasn't planned, but it was murder, born from obsession, fueled by desperation, and sealed by rejection. For Detective Collins, the case was clear. The confession, the evidence, the motive. All that remained now was justice. March 2nd, 2007, the trial of George Sinclair officially began. The courtroom in Westfield was packed. Reporters, neighbors, friends. No one could believe that the quiet, polite man next door was now on trial for second-degree murder. George sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched, eyes downcast. His face was pale, his hands trembled. He looked nothing like a cold-blooded killer, but that was exactly what the prosecution aimed to prove. They wasted no time painting a chilling picture. A man consumed by obsession, who mistook attention for affection. And when Helen finally said enough, he snapped. They described how George had grown possessive, jealous, how he began appearing at Helen's home even uninvited, how he couldn't let go when the affair ended. The fingerprints on the trophy, the blood-stained shirt, the confession he made to Detective Collins, it was all there, presented with clinical precision. The prosecution's message was simple. This was not a crime of love, it was a crime of control. But the defense pushed back, hard. George, they said, was not a monster. He was a man who had been lonely for too long, who found connection late in life and clung to it too tightly. They didn't deny the affair, they didn't deny the death. But they argued that what happened that day was a moment of madness, not murder. And then they dropped a bombshell. Maybe George wasn't the only one with motive. David Witman, Helen's husband, had discovered the affair weeks before her death. He had confronted Helen. There had been an argument. And after that, everything changed. The defense floated an alternative theory. Could David, humiliated, enraged, have found a way to stage the scene? Could George have been manipulated into taking the fall? It was a bold strategy, and though circumstantial, it planted a seed of doubt. Witnesses took the stand. Emails were read aloud. A chilling timeline unfolded. And through it all, the community sat divided. Some saw George as a broken man who cracked. Others saw him as a predator who disguised himself as harmless. The trial dragged on for weeks, but eventually the jury would have to decide. Was this a tragic accident born of emotional collapse, or a calculated act of revenge masked by grief? March 2nd, 2007, the jury had reached a verdict. After 3 weeks of testimony, cross-examinations, and emotional breakdowns, the courtroom was silent as 12 jurors returned to their seats. George Sinclair sat motionless, his eyes fixed on the floor. David Witman was present too, expression unreadable, arms crossed. Reporters raised their pens. Cameras clicked in anticipation. Then came the words, "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of second-degree murder." A gasp rippled through the room. George didn't speak. He didn't flinch, but a single tear rolled down his cheek as he closed his eyes. The judge sentenced him to 25 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 15. The gavel came down, and just like that, the case was closed. George Sinclair, the quiet man next door, was now inmate number 23,794. As he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Neighbors who once waved to him from across the street looked away. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, the town of Westfield struggled to move on. A community built on image, order, and routine had been cracked open. And beneath the manicured lawns and white fences, people began to wonder what other secrets lay hidden. Helen's funeral was held in quiet dignity, but whispers followed David wherever he went. Though never charged, some still believed he had a hand. If not in the murder, then in the chain of events that led to it. George, meanwhile, never appealed the verdict. He remained in prison, withdrawn, quiet, rarely speaking to anyone. In rare interviews, he maintained only one thing: "I loved her. I just didn't know how to let her go." In the end, Helen Witman became another tragic name in the long list of lives lost not to strangers, not to criminals, but to someone who once said, "I love you." And perhaps that's the part that hurts the most, because this wasn't just a crime of passion, it was a story of silence, of loneliness, of unchecked emotions left to rot beneath the surface. In the aftermath, Westfield would never be the same. And for those who lived through it, the lesson was chillingly simple. Even in the safest places, love can kill. If this case left you speechless, just wait until you hear what happened when a housewife began an affair with her father-in-law and her husband found out. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the bell icon, and join us for more stories that reveal the dark truths hiding behind closed doors.